The chamber lights flickered once, and every eye in the room turned toward me. I was Ethan Cole, human ambassador to the Galaxy Council, and I had just been told that my species was too dangerous to be trusted with its own borders. The delegate speaking was a tall being named Vos Kalen, skin the color of wet slate, eyes like twin rings of dull silver. He stood at the center podium, addressing the full assembly of 42 species, and his voice carried the practiced calm of someone who believed he was doing me a favor. "The proposal is simple," Vos said. "Humanity's fleet expansion will be capped at current levels. Their weapons research will be monitored by a joint council committee. Their colonization rights beyond the Kelvar line will be suspended pending further review." I sat very still. Around me, the other delegates murmured their approval, soft chimes of agreement rippling through translator devices in a dozen different tones. It was almost polite, the way they were trying to put a leash on an entire civilization. "May I respond?" I asked. Vos inclined his head, the universal gesture for permission granted, though his eyes did not leave mine. I stood. The chamber was shaped like a bowl, tiers of seats rising around a central floor, and from where I stood, I could see every species that called itself part of the Concord. Beings with 4 arms and beings with none. Beings who breathed methane, and beings who breathed nothing at all, existing instead as patterns of light, held together by technology older than my planet's written history. And every single one of them was looking at me the way you might look at a child who had picked up something sharp. "Ambassador Kalen," I said, "may I ask a question first?" "Of course. How many rescue operations has humanity conducted in conquered space over the last standard decade?" A pause. Vos glanced toward his data assistant, a small hovering drone that blinked twice before answering in a flat mechanical tone. "Human vessels have responded to 187 distress calls across Concord territory. And how many of those responses involved no Concord assets present at all? Just us?" Another pause, longer this time. 161. I let that number sit in the air for a moment. "We have pulled your ships out of collapsing gravity wells," I said. "We have carried medicine to outposts that your own fleets called too far, too costly, too risky. We built listening stations on the edge of conquered space that half of you refused to fund, and we did it because it needed doing, not because anyone asked us to." "Ambassador Cole," Vos said, his tone still even, "no one disputes humanity's contributions. This is precisely why the Council wishes to formalize your role. Oversight is not punishment, it is structure." "It is a leash," I said, dressed up in kind words. A ripple of discomfort moved through the chamber. I heard the soft clicking of a Vezrathi delegate's mandibles, a sound I had learned meant disapproval. "You speak as if the Council has never protected humanity," said a new voice. This one belonged to Ambassador Sella Rin, a delegate whose species resembled tall reeds of pale blue light, swaying even when there was no wind in the chamber. "When your colony on Farron's Reach was threatened by raiders, it was Concord ships that responded first." 3 ships, I said, out of a fleet request for 12, and they arrived 4 days after the threat had already passed, because we handled it ourselves. Sella Rin's light dimmed slightly, a sign of species embarrassment I recognized from years of sitting in that chamber. But Vos pressed on, unwilling to let the moment slip away from him. "The vote has already been scheduled," he said. "Tomorrow, this council will decide whether humanity's expansion will be limited for the safety of all member species. We ask only that you accept the outcome with the same grace you claim to bring to every rescue and every act of goodwill." And there it was. The real message beneath all the careful diplomatic language. They were not asking me anything. They had already decided. This entire session had been theater, a courtesy extended before the real decision was made somewhere else, in some smaller room I had never been invited into. I thought about my grandmother, who used to tell me stories about a time before the stars, when humanity nearly destroyed itself with its own hands, and how the lesson we carried forward from that was never about power. It was about respect. Respect given honestly, and respect demanded when it was withheld. Ambassador Kalen, I said quietly, I want to thank the Council for its transparency today. Voss looked pleased, mistaking my words for surrender. You have shown me exactly where humanity stands with this body, I continued. Not as a partner, not as an equal, as a resource to be measured, capped, and filed away for safekeeping. That is not what this council intends, Voss said, his calm finally slipping just slightly. Then perhaps the council should reconsider what it intends, I said, because as of this moment, humanity is withdrawing from these talks. The chamber went silent in a way I had never heard it go silent before. Even the ambient hum of translation devices seemed to fade. Ambassador Cole, Sella Rin said carefully, her light flickering with what might have been alarm. Withdrawing from the talks does not mean withdrawing from the Concord itself. I looked at her, and for a moment I almost softened. Almost. But I thought of the 161 rescues, and the 4 days of silence on Farron's Reach, and the leash they had tried to hand me wrapped in polite language. We will honor every existing agreement already signed, I said. But we will not sit at a table where our seat is a formality and our voice is a suggestion to be voted down. Effective immediately, humanity withdraws from all further negotiations, all joint committees, and all voluntary support programs currently unbound by treaty. You cannot simply leave, Voss said, and for the first time his voice rose, just slightly, just enough to show the crack beneath the calm. There are protocols, there are procedures. There are, I agreed, and we followed every one of them today. I stood, I asked permission to speak. I answered honestly. Now I am telling you honestly that we are done being spoken about instead of spoken with. I gathered the small data tablet in front of me, the one holding nothing more than notes I would never need again, and I turned toward the exit at the base of the chamber. Behind me, the human delegation, 11 aides and advisors, who had sat quietly through the entire session, rose in near-perfect unison and followed. No one shouted, no one threatened, there was no dramatic gesture, no closing insult thrown over my shoulder. Just the sound of footsteps, calm and unhurried, moving toward the tall doors at the chamber's edge. I paused only once, at the threshold, and looked back at the assembly. 42 species, hundreds of delegates, and in that moment, every single one of them was staring at an empty podium where a human voice used to be. The council will reach whatever decision it reaches, I said. We will not be in the room to hear it. The doors closed behind us with a soft mechanical sigh, and the sound of that closing door was the last thing the Galaxy Council heard from humanity for a very long time. Outside, in the wide marble corridor that connected the chamber to the transport bay, my aide, a sharp-eyed young woman named Nora Ellery, fell into step beside me. "That's it?" she asked. "No demands? No terms for coming back?" "No terms," I said. "Let them wonder what we want. Let them sit with the silence." She glanced back at the closed doors, and I could see the question in her eyes, the same question I imagined was forming in the minds of every delegate still inside that chamber. What happens now? I did not have an answer yet, but I knew one thing with complete certainty as we walked toward the ships waiting to take us home. The Council had spent years treating humanity like a problem to be managed. They were about to learn what it felt like to solve every problem humanity used to solve for them, alone, without help, and without warning. Behind us, the chamber doors remained closed, and inside them, 42 species sat in a silence none of them knew how to break. 3 weeks passed before anyone outside our own government understood what silence actually meant. I spent those weeks back on Earth, in a modest office overlooking the harbor of a coastal city, reading reports instead of giving speeches. My work now was quieter, but no less important. Every joint program humanity had once supported was being wound down, carefully, without drama, exactly the way I had promised in that chamber. No sabotage, no parting insults, just an absence where our presence used to be. The first sign of trouble came from a shipping corridor near the Thren asteroid field, a region 6 species relied on for the movement of food and medical supplies between their home systems. Humanity had quietly operated a navigation relay there for years, a service so unremarkable that most delegates had probably forgotten it existed. We shut it down on schedule, along with everything else, and within 4 days, 3 separate convoys reported navigation failures serious enough to force them into emergency holding patterns. Nora brought me the report herself, tablet in hand, her expression somewhere between concern and quiet satisfaction. "They're calling it a technical anomaly," she said. "No one wants to admit the relay was ours." "It will happen again," I said. "Somewhere else, something bigger." She sat across from me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the window, gulls circled over gray water, indifferent to galaxies and councils, and the slow unraveling of alliances built over decades. "Do you regret it?" she asked finally. I thought about the question honestly before answering. No. But I don't take any pleasure in it either. We didn't leave to hurt anyone. We left because we were tired of being managed instead of heard. "They might not see the difference." "They will," I said, "eventually." My grandmother used to tell me about the years before humanity reached the stars, when our own history was still writing itself in fire and mistakes. She grew up in the aftermath of a century that had seen humanity nearly break itself apart through war and pride, and she carried forward a single lesson that shaped everything about how our species approached the wider universe once we finally left our solar system behind. Never demand respect through force, earn it through reliability, and defend it through refusal. That lesson had guided nearly every choice humanity made among the stars. We never sought to conquer or dominate. We built things instead. Relay stations, medical convoys, terraforming projects that other species considered too costly or too slow to be worth the investment. We did the unglamorous work because someone needed to, and because doing it well was its own kind of statement. But somewhere along the way, the Council had stopped seeing that work as a choice we made freely and started treating it as an obligation we owed them. And obligations, unlike gifts, can be resented the moment they are questioned. 2 more weeks passed. The reports kept coming, each one a little more serious than the last. A terraforming project on a distant moon, one of several human engineering teams had been quietly overseeing for a coalition of 3 smaller species, stalled completely when our technicians did not renew their contracts. The coalition scrambled to find replacement engineers and discovered, to their evident shock, that very few other species in the Concord possessed the specialized knowledge required for a project of that scale. A defense treaty along a contested border, one that had relied for years on a joint patrol arrangement between human vessels and 2 allied species, quietly lapsed when human ships did not show up for their scheduled rotation. The 2 allied species found themselves patrolling alone for the first time in over a decade, and within days their sensors picked up increased activity from raiders who had clearly been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. None of it was intentional on our part. We were not orchestrating a campaign of pressure. We had simply stopped filling gaps that had always been ours to fill by choice, and the shape of those gaps was only now becoming visible to everyone else. I received a message during this time from an old friend, a delegate named Oren Vashti, whose species had worked alongside humanity on several joint scientific ventures over the years. He did not contact me through official channels, choosing instead a private encrypted line that would not appear in any council record. "Ethan," his message read, "I do not envy what is happening in the chamber right now. Half the council wants to censure you publicly. The other half wants to send an apology delegation before things get worse. No one seems to be able to agree on which humiliation is more embarrassing." I smiled reading that, though there was little humor in the situation itself. "Tell me honestly," I wrote back, "do they understand yet what they lost?" His reply took 2 days to arrive, longer than usual, and when it did, it was longer than his messages typically were. "Some of them do," he wrote. "I sat in a private session yesterday where a delegate from the outer systems admitted, quietly, that humanity had been carrying weight the rest of us never fully acknowledged. But pride is a strange thing, Ethan. Even delegates who understand the mistake are reluctant to be the one who says it aloud in front of the others. I understood that reluctance better than he probably realized. Pride had nearly destroyed my own species once, in an age before any of us had looked up at the stars and wondered what else was out there. It seemed strange, and a little sad, that pride could travel between civilizations just as easily as it traveled between individuals. The council convened an emergency session near the end of that third week, the first full session in the chamber's long history, conducted without a single human delegate present. I did not attend, of course, since I no longer held a seat at that table, but Oren managed to send me a summary afterward, careful and diplomatic in the way only a longtime ally could manage. The session, he told me, had been chaotic almost from the start. Delegates argued over who bore responsibility for the walkout, some insisting it had been an overreaction on humanity's part, others quietly acknowledging that the proposed restrictions had been unreasonable from the beginning. Ambassador Voss Kalin, the delegate who had led the original proposal, found himself the target of pointed questions from species who had quietly relied on human support for years and were only now beginning to understand the cost of losing it. He tried to defend the original vote, Oren wrote. He said humanity's absence would be temporary, that you would return once the initial frustration passed. Several delegates did not seem convinced. One of them asked him directly whether he had considered what would happen if humanity did not come back at all. I read that line twice, turning the words over in my mind. It was the question the entire council had avoided asking themselves before that vote was ever scheduled. What happens if the ones doing the quiet, difficult work simply decide they are done being taken for granted? Back on Earth, our own leadership remained calm and deliberate, holding to the plan we had agreed upon before I ever stood up in that chamber. We would not gloat. We would not send messages demanding apology or concession. We would simply continue living, continue building, continue existing exactly as we always had, and let the absence of our presence in Concord affairs speak entirely for itself. It was strange, in a way, how quiet those weeks felt. For years, my life had been built around the rhythm of council sessions, endless committee meetings, careful negotiations over resources and territory and rights. Now my days were filled with something closer to ordinary work, reviewing domestic reports, meeting with engineers who had once been assigned to Concord projects and were now free to focus entirely on human priorities for the first time in years. Nora noticed the change in me before I did. "You look lighter," she said one afternoon, as we reviewed a proposal to redirect several engineering teams toward a new colony project within our own solar system. "I feel lighter," I admitted. "I didn't realize how much weight I was carrying until I put it down." "Do you think they'll ask us back?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "I think they'll have to. Not because they respect us more than they did 3 weeks ago, but because they've realized how much of their own stability depended on something they never bothered to properly value. And if they don't ask, then we keep building," I said. "We were never waiting for their permission to exist." That evening, as I walked along the harbor near my office, watching the last light fade over calm water, I thought again of my grandmother's lesson, the one about earning respect through reliability and defending it through refusal. We had spent decades earning it. Now, for the first time, we were defending it, and the shape of that defense was not anger or force, but simply the quiet, steady sound of our own footsteps walking away. Somewhere among the stars, 42 species were beginning to understand exactly how much of their world had been quietly held together by hands they had stopped bothering to thank. The crisis, when it finally arrived, did not come from the Thren asteroid field or the contested border where raiders had grown bold. It came from a place almost no one expected, a quiet agricultural colony called Dessa's Hollow, home to a small species known as the Farallon, gentle beings who had never fielded a proper military fleet in their entire recorded history. The Farallon had survived among the stars for generations by relying almost entirely on the protection of larger allied species, arrangement that had worked well enough for a long time because humanity had quietly served as one of their primary guarantors of safety. Our ships patrolled their outer systems. Our engineers helped stabilize their aging orbital farms. It was, by any measure, a small commitment for us, and an enormous one for them. When our patrols ended along with everything else, the Farallon did not immediately understand the danger they were in. Their government assumed, reasonably enough, that the Council would simply redirect other Allied fleets to cover the gap. But the Council, still tangled in its own internal disagreements about how to respond to humanity's absence, moved slowly, and slow movement in matters of security has a way of becoming its own kind of disaster. A raider fleet, one that had been probing the edges of Concord space for months without finding an opening bold enough to exploit, finally found exactly what it was looking for. Dessa's Hollow, undefended and unaware, became the target of a coordinated approach that its own tiny defense forces had no meaningful way to resist. I learned about it the way most of the galaxy did, through an emergency broadcast that reached human space nearly 6 hours after the situation began unfolding. Nora burst into my office without knocking, tablet already displaying the alert. "Ethan, you need to see this." The broadcast was grainy, relayed through several intermediary systems before reaching us, but the message was clear enough. The Farallon government was requesting immediate assistance from any Concord member capable of responding, and so far, no one had. "Where are the Allied fleets?" I asked. "Someone must be closer than we are." "Two systems that used to coordinate with human patrols," Nora said. "Their own ships are spread too thin, covering the routes we use to help protect. They're requesting Council authorization to redirect a joint fleet, but that requires a vote, and votes take time." I felt something tighten in my chest, an old and familiar instinct that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the simple fact that people were in danger and no one seemed able to move fast enough to help them. "How long before the situation becomes irreversible?" I asked. "Estimates vary. Some analysts say hours. Others say it may already be too late to prevent significant damage to their agricultural infrastructure, which for a species like the Farallon could mean a famine that lasts for years." I sat with that information for a long moment, weighing everything I knew about the situation against everything I had promised myself and my government about how we would handle the aftermath of leaving the Council. We had agreed not to punish anyone. We had agreed not to use our absence as a weapon. But we had also agreed that we were done being taken for granted, and I understood, sitting there, that those two commitments were about to be tested against each other in a way none of us had anticipated. "Get me a line to the Defense Council," I said. Now. Within the hour, I found myself in a secure briefing room, speaking not to Concord delegates but to our own military leadership, a small group of admirals and strategists who had spent the last 3 weeks focused entirely on domestic priorities. "The Farallon have no formal treaty obligation with us anymore," said Admiral Priya Anand, a sharp, measured woman who had overseen humanity's fleet operations for nearly a decade. "Our patrol agreement lapsed along with every other Concord arrangement. We have no legal requirement to respond." "I'm aware of that," I said. "I'm not asking about legal requirements. I'm asking whether we are capable of responding in time to prevent serious harm to a population of civilians who have nothing to do with the Council's decisions." Admiral Anand studied me for a long moment before answering. "We have a response fleet within range. It could reach Dessa's Hollow in just under 5 hours." "Then send it." "Ethan," she said carefully, "if we respond to this crisis without any formal request or agreement, it sends a message. It suggests our withdrawal from the Council was never really about principle. It suggests we can be called back into service whenever someone needs us badly enough." I understood her concern, and it was a fair one, but I also understood something else, something that mattered more to me in that moment than any question of political messaging. "We are not responding because the Council asked us to," I said. "We are responding because there are people in danger, and we have the ability to help them. Those are two very different reasons, and I intend to make that distinction very clear once this is over." Admiral Anand held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "I'll give the order." The human fleet arrived at Dessa's Hollow 4 hours and 52 minutes after the order was given, moving with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized humanity's presence in Concord space for years. There was no dramatic announcement, no broadcast declaring our arrival to the wider galaxy. Our ships simply appeared, positioned themselves between the raider fleet and the vulnerable orbital farms below, and made their presence unmistakably clear without a single shot needing to be fired. The raiders, whatever their reasons, chose to withdraw rather than test themselves against a fleet they had not expected to encounter. Within an hour of our arrival, the threat to Dessa's Hollow had passed entirely, and the Faraloon government sent a message of gratitude so overwhelming that Nora had to summarize it for me, rather than reading the entire thing aloud. News of the incident spread through Concord space within a day, and the reaction, as Oren later described it to me, was complicated in ways that surprised even him. Some delegates are furious, he wrote. They see it as proof that humanity still considers itself the galaxy's protector, acting unilaterally without council authorization. Others are deeply relieved, and a few, quietly, are ashamed that it took a near disaster for anyone to understand how much depended on arrangements they had stopped valuing. I read his message carefully, weighing the different reactions against each other. The fury did not surprise me. Neither did the relief. What surprised me was the shame, because shame, unlike anger, has a way of leading people toward change rather than away from it. The council convened another emergency session within days, and this time the discussion, according to every account I received, was far less chaotic than the one that had followed our initial withdrawal. There was no more pretending the situation would simply resolve itself if everyone waited long enough. The Faraloon incident had made the stakes impossible to ignore. Ambassador Voss Kalin, the same delegate who had led the original proposal against humanity, reportedly said very little during that session, a notable change from his usual confident presence at the podium. Sela Rin, the delegate whose light had dimmed with embarrassment during my final session in the chamber, spoke at length instead, arguing that the council needed to acknowledge, publicly and formally, that its treatment of humanity had been a serious miscalculation. Not everyone agreed with her, of course. Pride, as I had already learned, does not disappear simply because circumstances demand it should. Several delegates argued that the Faraloon incident proved nothing beyond humanity's tendency toward unilateral action, a habit they considered just as concerning as the restrictions the original proposal had sought to impose. But something had shifted, undeniably, in the balance of the conversation. For the first time since I had walked out of that chamber, the question being debated was no longer whether humanity needed to be managed. It was whether the council could survive without us at all. I did not attend that session, of course, since I still held no seat at the table. But I followed the reports closely from my office overlooking the harbor, and I found myself thinking, more than once, about how strange it was that it had taken a crisis at the edge of Concord space to make visible something that should have been obvious all along. We had never asked to be indispensable. We had simply tried to be useful, quietly and consistently, for as long as anyone could remember. It was the council, not humanity, that had mistaken quiet reliability for something owed rather than something given, and it was the council, not humanity, that was now discovering exactly how expensive that mistake could become. Nora found me that evening still reviewing reports long after most of the office had gone home for the night. "They're going to ask us back," she said, not as a question but as a simple observation. "I know," I said. "Are we going to say yes?" I thought about the Faraloon and the raider fleet that had withdrawn without a single shot fired, and the strange, quiet satisfaction of doing the right thing for its own sake, rather than for any political advantage it might bring. "That depends," I said, "on what they're finally willing to offer in return." The delegation arrived on Earth 11 days after the Faraloon incident, a smaller group than I expected, just 3 delegates and a handful of aides, traveling aboard a modest diplomatic vessel rather than the grand ceremonial ships the council typically favored for important visits. I took that as a deliberate choice, a signal that this was meant to feel like a conversation rather than a spectacle. Sela Rin led the delegation, her pale blue light dimmer than usual as she stepped off the transport ramp into the open air of the harbor city where I had spent the last several weeks working. Beside her stood a delegate I did not recognize, a broad-shouldered being with deep bronze skin, named Torvek Amos, representing a coalition of smaller species that had grown increasingly vocal in recent weeks. And to my genuine surprise, the third member of the delegation was Ambassador Voss Kalin himself. I met them at a modest reception hall near the harbor, chosen specifically because it lacked the imposing formality of a proper council chamber. I wanted this conversation to happen between people, not between institutions. "Ambassador Cole," Celerin said, her voice carrying none of the practiced calm I remembered from the chamber. "Thank you for agreeing to see us." "Of course," I said. "Please, sit." We settled around a simple table near a wide window overlooking the water, and for a long moment no one spoke. It was Voss who finally broke the silence, and his voice, when it came, carried none of the confidence I remembered either. "I owe you an apology, Ambassador Cole," he said, "not simply for the proposal I brought before the council, but for the assumptions underlying it. I genuinely believed, that humanity's growth needed to be managed for the safety of all member species. I did not understand, until recently, how much of the council's own stability depended on trusting humanity rather than restraining it." I studied him for a moment, weighing the sincerity of his words against the memory of his voice rising in that chamber, insisting there were protocols, insisting we could not simply leave. But people, I reminded myself, are capable of learning, even when the lesson arrives at considerable cost. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, "but an apology alone will not bring us back to that table." "We understand," Celerin said quickly. "That is why we have come with more than words." Torvek Amos spoke for the first time, his voice deep and measured. "The Council has drafted a proposal for restructuring humanity's standing among the Concord, not as a species under observation, but as a founding member with full voting authority equal to any other seat at the table." I raised an eyebrow. "Full voting authority? That is a significant change from where things stood 11 days ago." "It is," Torvek agreed, "and it did not come easily. There are still delegates who resist the idea, who believe humanity's absence proved only that we need better contingency planning, not a fundamental change in how we treat you. But the majority, I believe, finally understands what the Faraloon incident made undeniable. Humanity was never simply a member of this concord. It was, in many ways, the structure holding a great deal of it together, quietly, without recognition." I sat with that for a long moment, thinking about my grandmother's lesson once more, the one about earning respect through reliability and defending it through refusal. We had done both. Now, it seemed, the defense had actually worked. "There is something else," Celerin said, her light brightening slightly, the closest thing I had seen to genuine warmth from her since I had known her. "The Council has also agreed to formally recognize every unofficial contribution humanity has made over the years. The rescues, the relay stations, the engineering projects no one else was equipped to handle. There will be a permanent record, and more importantly, a permanent acknowledgement that these contributions were never obligations. They were choices, made freely, and deserving of gratitude rather than expectation." I felt something ease in my chest that I had not realized was still tense until that moment. It was not the acknowledgement itself that mattered most to me, though it mattered a great deal. It was the fact that the Council had finally understood the distinction I had tried to draw in that emergency briefing room, the difference between help freely given and help demanded as a right. "I will need to discuss this with our own leadership before I can give you an answer," I said. "This is not a decision I can make alone, not for something of this significance." "Of course," Celerin said. "Take whatever time you need. We have already waited far longer than we should have to understand what we nearly lost." Before they departed, Voss asked to speak with me privately, and I agreed, walking with him along the harbor path while the others waited near the transport. "I want you to know," he said, "that I did not come here simply because the political calculus demanded it. I came because I have spent the last 11 days thinking about every session we ever shared in that chamber, and I realized I never once asked you what humanity actually wanted from this concord. I assumed. I decided on your behalf what safety and structure should look like for your people, and I never stopped to ask if that was something you needed, or something I simply believed you needed. That is the heart of it, I said. We never ask to be protected from our own choices. We ask to be trusted to make them, and to be held accountable, like anyone else, when we made the wrong ones. Voss nodded slowly. I understand that now. I hope, in time, I can prove that understanding through more than words. Time will tell, I said, and I meant it honestly, without bitterness. Over the following days, I brought the Council's proposal before our own leadership, a careful process involving representatives from every major human government and colony, a process my grandmother would have recognized well, since it mirrored the same messy, deliberate democracy that had guided humanity through every difficult decision since long before the stars. The debate was thorough. Some argued we should demand even more before agreeing to return, using our newfound leverage to secure permanent protections against any future attempt to restrict our growth. Others argued we should return with grace, without pressing our advantage further than necessary, trusting that the changed relationship would prove itself over time rather than through additional demands. I found myself somewhere in the middle of those positions, and when I finally stood before the full assembly of human representatives to share my own recommendation, I spoke plainly, the same way I had spoken in that chamber weeks earlier. We did not leave the Council to gain leverage, I said. We left because we refused to be treated as less than equal partners in something we helped build. If we return now and immediately begin demanding more than fair treatment, we prove exactly what our critics within the Concord have always feared, that humanity cannot be trusted with genuine equality because we will always reach for more. But if we return simply because we were asked nicely, without any real change to the structure that failed us in the first place, we prove something else entirely. We prove that our walkout was theater, a temporary tantrum, rather than a genuine stand for something we believed in. I believe the answer lies between those two extremes. We return, and we accept the seat they have offered us, full and equal, exactly as it has been proposed. We do not ask for more, because more was never the point. But we make it clear, permanently and unmistakably, that if this Concord ever again mistakes our reliability for an obligation rather than a choice, we will not hesitate to remind them, exactly as we did before, of everything that quiet reliability was holding together. The vote that followed was not unanimous, but it was decisive, and within the week, I found myself preparing to return to the Council chamber for the first time since I had walked out of it, this time not as a delegate seeking permission to speak, but as an equal voice among 42 other equal voices. The chamber looked exactly as I remembered it, the same bowl-shaped tiers rising around a central floor, the same soft hum of translation devices working through a dozen different tones at once. But when I stepped through the tall doors this time, something in the room felt different before a single word was spoken. Delegates who had once barely acknowledged my presence now turned to watch me cross the floor with an attention that felt closer to respect than curiosity. Sella Rin's pale blue light brightened visibly as I passed her seat, and even Torvek Amos, whom I had only recently come to know, offered a small nod of welcome. My seat had changed as well. Where once I had occupied a smaller station near the edge of the human delegations section, I now stood at a podium newly positioned among the other founding members, equal in placement, equal in prominence, exactly as the proposal had promised. Ambassador Voss Kalen stood near the central platform, waiting to open the session, and when our eyes met, he offered something I had never once seen from him during all my years in that chamber, a genuine, unguarded smile. "The Council recognizes Ambassador Ethan Cole," he said, returning representative of humanity, and by unanimous vote of the full assembly, a founding member of this Concord with equal standing among all species present. A soft chime rang through the chamber, the formal signal marking a significant proceeding, and for a moment I simply stood there, letting the weight of it settle over me. Weeks earlier, I had walked out of this exact room in silence, uncertain whether humanity would ever again hold a voice within these walls. Now I stood here again, not as someone seeking permission, but as someone whose presence the Concord had finally learned it could not do without. "Thank you, Ambassador Kalen," I said, and my voice carried through the chamber with none of the tension I remembered from our last exchange. "It is good to be back." The session that followed was unlike any I had attended before. Where once discussions of humanity's role had circled endlessly around questions of restriction and oversight, the agenda now focused on genuine collaboration, joint projects to rebuild the relay stations that had gone dark during our absence, renewed patrol agreements structured as true partnerships rather than favors extended and expected in return, and a formal review process ensuring no single species, human or otherwise, would ever again find itself managed rather than heard. Rin proposed the creation of a permanent council committee dedicated specifically to recognizing unofficial contributions across all member species, ensuring that no civilization's quiet reliability would again be mistaken for obligation rather than gift. The proposal passed with an overwhelming majority, and I found myself thinking, as the vote concluded, that perhaps something genuinely good had come from those difficult weeks after all. Near the end of the session, Voss approached me privately, away from the central floor, his manner far more relaxed than I had ever seen it during our earlier encounters. "I have been thinking," he said, "about something you told me on your world, near the water, about trust, and about being held accountable rather than restrained." "I remember," I said. "I believe that lesson extends beyond humanity," he said. "I believe this entire Concord has spent generations mistaking careful management for safety, when perhaps genuine safety comes from trusting each member species to govern itself and simply holding each other accountable when that trust is broken." "That would be a significant change," I said, "for a body as old as this one." "Change is rarely comfortable," Voss said, "but I suspect you already knew that better than any of us." I smiled at that, the first genuine smile I had allowed myself within these walls in longer than I could remember. We did not choose comfort, Ambassador Kalen. We chose to be honest about what we needed, and to accept the consequences of that honesty, whatever they turned out to be. "A lesson worth remembering," he said, "for all of us." As the session drew to its close, I found myself standing near the same threshold where I had once paused to deliver my final words before walking away from this chamber entirely. This time, I did not turn to leave. I remained, watching as delegates from 42 species gathered their materials, exchanging quiet conversation, planning future collaborations with an ease that had not existed here in years. Nora found me afterward in the corridor outside, her expression carrying the same sharp curiosity I had come to rely on throughout the entire ordeal. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Being back?" I considered the question carefully before answering, watching through a nearby window as ships from a dozen different species moved peacefully through the space beyond the station, no longer strangers wary of one another, but partners rebuilding something worth preserving. "It feels earned," I said. "Not given, earned." "Do you think it will last?" she asked. "The change, I mean. Real equality, not just words in a proposal." I thought about my grandmother again, about the lesson she had carried forward from an age of mistakes humanity had made and survived, the lesson about earning respect through reliability and defending it through refusal when that respect was withheld. "I think it will last as long as we remember what it cost to get here," I said. "Both sides. If they forget, if they slip back into old habits of managing rather than trusting, we will remind them again, exactly as we did before. And if we forget, if we let this new standing make us careless or proud, they will have every right to remind us in return." "That sounds like a fragile kind of peace," Nora said. "All peace is fragile," I said. "The difference is whether the people holding it understand that and choose to protect it anyway." We walked together toward the transport that would carry us back to Earth, passing delegates from species whose names I had once struggled to pronounce and now knew as well as my own colleagues. Rin caught my eye as we passed her section and offered a final, warm exchange of light, a gesture I had learned, over the years, meant something close to genuine friendship. Outside the station, framed against the endless dark scattered with more stars than any single lifetime could ever hope to visit, I thought about how far humanity had traveled since the days my grandmother used to describe, a species once nearly broken by its own mistakes, now standing as an equal voice among dozens of others scattered across the galaxy. We had never wanted to rule this Concord, and we had never wanted to be ruled by it either. We had simply wanted what any reasonable people want: to be trusted, to be heard, and to be treated as partners rather than problems to be managed from a distance. It had taken a walkout, a crisis, and 11 long days of quiet reckoning to teach an entire galaxy something humanity had understood about itself for generations. Respect given freely was worth more than obedience demanded through fear, and reliability, offered as a gift, could never be mistaken for an obligation without cost. As our ship pulled away from the station, I looked back one final time at the chamber where it had all begun, the same room I had walked out of in silence weeks earlier, now filled with the quiet, steady work of building something better than what had existed before. Humanity had left the talks once, and the galaxy had learned exactly what that silence cost. Now, returning as equals rather than subjects, I found myself hopeful, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that the lesson would hold. Not because anyone had forced it to, but because, finally, everyone at that table had chosen it for themselves.